I'm doing unprecedented solo today. Michael Popak is traveling for the holidays. We actually have some pretty cool cases. Wish we could have him to discuss, but I'm going to lay it all out for you. And as we get closer to the Supreme Court oral arguments on the case, Michael Popak and I will definitely recap them. I hope everybody else, if they're traveling for the holidays, or have safe holidays and hopefully not too much, not too many delays as they travel across, and those staying put and staying home. Hopefully things will go well. As news is still coming in, the political news is still coming in, the Supreme Court news is still coming in. So we'll keep you as updated as possible as we go through the holidays here. So unprecedented, our focus on the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court just made a decision yesterday to take on two new cases, one having to do with TikTok and the other having to do with Planned Parenthood. So two big cases coming on the horizon for the Supreme Court. The first one they will hear will have to do with TikTok. They planned oral arguments for January 10th. Now, as you know, Congress last year passed a law saying TikTok will be banned on January 19th of 2025 unless it's sold. And TikTok immediately went to court, said that this was a violation of the First Amendment and it should be overturned. They asked the Supreme Court to take it on an expedited basis, and the Supreme Court agreed to do that, scheduling oral arguments for January 10th. Interestingly, they didn't pause, put on hold the law. So if they take the case, they'll hear the oral arguments and do not make a decision before the 19th, that law will go into effect. So we may very well hear a decision from them before that January 19th. The fact that they are willing to take the case on so quickly and not pause it makes you think that they will make a decision before the 19th, which will, yes, for those of you following the Supreme Court, it would be a very quick turnaround. We're talking about 9 days. So possibly they might suspend the law at that point. Or we're going to hear very quickly from the Supreme Court as to what is going to happen with TikTok. And just kind of to give you a little bit of a preview of it, but the oral arguments on the 10th, we will break down those oral arguments when we hear them. As we know, we're going to find out quite a bit just from the questioning. The justices often give us a sense of where they're leaning on that. But the Congress law, basically their justification for it says, national security. This is the reason why. They didn't make public any specific data or evidence as to what exactly, other than the fact that it is owned by by China. Other than that fact being national security, they didn't give any details. We haven't yet gotten the briefing to the Supreme Court from TikTok or the government on this case. Possibly the government might start, giving some of that evidence to the Supreme Court. But essentially what they have said, and they have said this for years, even before this law was passed, they didn't like that TikTok basically had access to the data, to the millions of data. But after that initial concern, TikTok basically had Oracle, an American company, in charge of the data, and they separated it. They said China never has access to the data, that this data, the American data, is only accessed by Oracle. And they did this in order to give confidence to the American government that China could not access this American data. And this was basically what TikTok's owner said in the hearings, the congressional hearings that were held about this before the law was passed. So there's that, but that's the argument. That's the congressional argument. The TikTok argument is that, that they are that they're shutting down the First Amendment. And this is interesting because this is not as clear, let's say, as to which size the justices are going to be, because we have seen Justice Thomas and Justice Alito, who normally are kind of always on the MAGA Republican side, and you would think maybe on the national security side, are big proponents of the First Amendment. They see their own causes being, quote, shut down, let's say, or they think their causes are unnecessarily shut down in institutions around the country, like colleges. And so they are big proponents of the First Amendment. So I would not be surprised if we didn't see Justice Alito and Justice Thomas asking questions and being supportive of the TikTok argument that shutting down TikTok would be a violation of the First Amendment. And then you have the more liberal justices, Sotomayor, Ketanji Brown Jackson, Kagan, which normally, again, would be supportive of the First Amendment. Typically, First Amendment rights you see as kind of like a more liberal, let's say, cause, right? Vietnam supporters and burning the flag, and that being a First Amendment right, and that being a First Amendment right seen more usually around liberal voices and liberal support and liberal application of the law, let's say. So we are, before oral arguments, I haven't heard any of the questions, obviously, for the Supreme Court justices. They might surprise us, but just knowing what we have seen from the conservative Alito and Thomas, who would typically, like back in the day, those versions of them, let's say those conservatives of them, would have been against the flag burning, wouldn't have seen that as First Amendment. But them now being more of a First Amendment proponents, along with the typical liberals, we might see support for TikTok's First Amendment rights and First Amendment argument these days, which we talk a lot about on Midas Touch and Legal AF about the disconnect, let's say, between mainstream media and how people really think. And that is perhaps most apparent on TikTok. I'm a big proponent of TikTok. I talk on TikTok all the time. I think it's one of the best ways of honestly finding out what people think about any issue, because people get to communicate and talk about issues there in a way certainly not on mainstream media. So I personally would hate to see TikTok banned or sold. They say even a sale of it could be hard because of the algorithm. The algorithm is kind of what makes TikTok. I mean, we see what happened with Twitter, right? Sure, Twitter still exists in the form of X, but after it was sold, Elon Musk changed the algorithm and started, prioritizing him and his themes. And to me, one of the biggest arguments for keeping TikTok is how is that not a national security that you have the richest man in the world owning X? We saw what a threat that was to national security, frankly, in this last election. We saw him promote his views. And even just the other day when he declared that he had to declare that the spending stopgap bill by Mike Johnson needs to end, he took control of that because of his 200 million followers on X, because he controlled the algorithm. He controlled what people saw. So his disinformation and frankly lies about what was in that spending bill became prominent. So how is that not a national security threat? Really? So that, I don't know if the Supreme Court will look at that, but here you have Mark Zuckerberg with Facebook saying he's going to change the algorithm so it suppresses, political news. Clearly influencing what people are seeing on Facebook and Instagram, and you have Elon Musk doing the same for X. How is that not national securities in their own way? And then here you have TikTok, who, yes, I don't think anybody wants China to have data, American data, to use in their own way. But if they have gone through all these loops and can prove that, China cannot access the data because Oracle accesses the data, how is that more of a national security threat than having these powerful men, control our conversation? Will that come into the Supreme Court? I mean, I think it makes a lot of sense. Like, is Congress picking and choosing what is a national security threat? isn't that whole idea of who's controlling social media kind of a big issue regardless of which platform? So we'll see if that comes into the conversation at all for oral argument. But that's where we are with TikTok. Supreme Court taking a look at it January 10th, probably making a decision about it before January 19th, something that I'm sure, obviously TikTok is a huge platform. I think a lot of people have like a vested interest to see what's going to come out in that. And their decisions, this is one of their biggest, will be, their big decision on the social media platform, the social media landscape, and the First Amendment. So really important, not just for TikTok, although that is so important for so many people who's on it, but how are we going to look at social media and our very important First Amendment rights, along with, what the government says is also an important national security threat? Is that a pretext? Is that valid? Is that both valid and a pretext? And is there any other way? That's most likely what the justices will be talking about. Is there any other way to protect our national security interests rather than banning it outright? And that's what the government is really going to have to try to show to the Supreme Court, was we had to do this. We tried everything else and it didn't work. And do they have that evidence? Because they didn't make that evidence known during the congressional hearings. Possibly it's there, and possibly there's going to be, but that's what they're going to have to say. They can't just say it. They're really going to have to show why this kind of really drastic action is necessary. So the next big case that the Supreme Court just decided to take has to do with abortion. So, the justices, when they overturned Roe, tried to act as if this was, going to provide some sort of clarity for the country, that returning it to the states would end the fight around abortion rights and reproductive rights. Clearly, that isn't the case. Clearly, it's done the exact opposite. And we are litigating this, every state, every jurisdiction, every, frankly, prosecutor dealing with this issue differently. South Carolina is a perfect example. Not only is the Supreme Court case they just decided to take coming out of South Carolina, but South Carolina, a group of people or Republicans there trying to pass a law wanting to prosecute abortion like homicide and making it punishable by the death penalty, if you can believe it. So South Carolina also right now at issue. It is Kerr versus Planned Parenthood. And what's at issue is in 2018, South Carolina there decided to withhold any Medicaid funding for Planned Parenthood. And this is separate than allowing any funding for abortions. That was not allowed. That was already outlawed. But this was specifically just any funding at all for Planned Parenthood, for their non-abortion services. And one of the patients there sued South Carolina, saying, you are denying me access to my medical care in an unlawful way. And this case has been started from the law they made there in 2018, finally making its way to the Supreme Court accepting the case, and they will be hearing the oral arguments in June. And what's at issue is Medicaid says that people have a right to pick their own healthcare provider. They have a right to pick their own healthcare provider, any qualified healthcare provider, anybody who's using Medicaid money and who has a patient who qualifies for Medicaid has a right to pick where they basically go to get care. And so the patient there is saying that you are denying me this right because you are saying that Planned Parenthood cannot get Medicaid funding. So I can't go as a Medicaid patient, I can't go to Planned Parenthood to get care. And this patient wants to be able to, because they do, Planned Parenthood, if you don't, I think most of you know, but Planned Parenthood does a lot more than provide abortions. They do their best to try to provide for low income patients by having extended hours, et cetera. And so this patient is saying, Planned Parenthood is a clearly qualified medical facility. I should be able to go there, but you're denying me this right by saying that Planned Parenthood cannot receive Medicaid funding. And so that's the issue that's coming before the court. And we've been seeing this in all of frankly, a lot of the abortion cases. They're not straight on abortion in terms of I have a right or don't have a right to an abortion, but like the attempt to outlaw the abortion pill in Texas by doing it by saying that the initial FDA approval, they tried to argue, was done incorrectly, and so it should be repealed. And the Supreme Court obviously did not agree with that. But we're seeing a similar thing here by trying to expand access to, well, not even here abortion, but just with a facility that's trying to help with women's reproductive care. And that's the fight, is they're trying to stop anything that's associated with like allowing women to have education, let's say, around the issue, or even trying to plan for their families with contraception. This is the fight. Like, this is where the fight is going to. So it's splintering off into so many different things. And so the Supreme Court is going to be answering the question of whether or not that language, that Medicaid language in the law that governs how the money is distributed, how patients who receive that funding from the government should be able to use their health care, because this is their health care, Medicaid. And this patient arguing that South Carolina is basically denying her care. So Michael Popak and I will also take a look at this hearing when it comes in the spring. Keep you updated on all the latest that the Supreme Court is doing, whether or not it has to do with TikTok, whether or not it has to do with abortion. You know, they constantly accept new cases, as you see here. They had all their cases in the beginning of the year on the docket that we've talked about, just such as the Tennessee ban having to do with the transgender affirming care. And then they continually add cases, such as the TikTok one, and such as this one having to do with Medicaid and Planned Parenthood. And so we'll keep you updated as the Supreme Court adds to their docket. Hope everybody is enjoying their holidays. We'll continue to keep you updated as news breaks. And we'll be really excited to have Michael Popak joining me next time to break this all down with me.
In collaboration with the Midas Touch Network, we just launched the Legal AF YouTube channel. Help us build this pro-democracy channel where I'll be curating the top stories at the intersection of law and politics. Go to YouTube now and free subscribe at Legal AF MTN. That's at Legal AF MTN.